Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Would you believe tonight's webinar is number 60? When we started this at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought we might do 2 or 3 webinars to help keep people connected. And tonight is webinar number 60. And just as I say that, we've got 60 people in the room, and now we're flying further and further up that number. So we've been joined by 5 fabulous guests who have given up loads of their own time to prepare for tonight, to attend the tech meeting that we have on the Monday night before the webinar, and given up tonight to really help us to think more deeply about hospital social work. Now, as we've been developing these webinars, because, you know, they came about because we were just responding to the pandemic. What can we do to help people just keep their learning going? But over time, we've really had time to think about what do we want to bring to these webinars each week. And we know from audience feedback and from the team that we thought, okay, we're going to start to do some context webinars where we look at the different contexts in which social workers work. And we decided we wanted to start off with hospital social work, thinking about the context of hospitals for a range of reasons, really, particularly in the UK. Thinking of the history of social work, it came to us in the UK really through hospital social work. So thinking about it from that angle. But we also know not just historically how important hospitals are for social work, but in the contemporary field, with all of the changes with the pandemic, we know that hospital-based social workers have been hugely impacted by the pandemic, by changed ways of working. And we wanted to hear a little bit about that. We also wanted to give real recognition to hospital social workers who are just right there at the really key times in people's lives. So we're really excited that we've been joined by 5 amazing hospital-based social workers all over all over England, I'd say. I'm not going to say the UK because we're spread across England, our guests are tonight. And they will introduce themselves as each one of them talks. But I know you're going to get a lot out of tonight. I'm really looking forward to tonight. Each guest will speak for about 10 minutes or so each. And then when they're not speaking, they'll be with you in the chat and in the Q&A. So if you've got a specific question about hospital-based social work, pop it into the Q&A, because our guests will be able to go in there and chat with you and chat in the chat as well when they're not actually presenting. So, without any further ado, I'm going to go straight into inviting our first guest to pop a mic on and introduce herself and talk you through her presentation. So Shelley, our first speaker tonight, is a social work apprentice. So Shelley, it's over to you.
Hi everyone, my name's Shelley and I'm based at Poole Hospital down in Dorset, and I've sort of been now in my 2nd year as an apprenticeship. I'm based in the one team which is linked in to social services at the main hospital. I just put a picture of my cats there because they probably spend a lot of time with me when I'm working from home and doing my studies. So they're Fiji and Suva, and they like to spend time sat in my desk drawers. So I'm just going to talk about really the discharge to assess pathway, which came in when COVID started. It's sort of previously we would obviously go up to the ward, but the discharge to assess that came in for COVID overtook that. So it was sort of more hospital-based led discharge that the health people would the ward would refer for a care package or interim placement, and social work input sort of via the D2A referral, which would go to our SPA team, and we'd obviously have some professionals from health and social just to agree the pathway for that person. Brokerage then would source the package of care, liaise with our social team, with the ward to arrange the discharge. Then this, on the day of discharge, it then goes over to what we call the one team. And on the day of discharge, for example, it would be allocated to myself, the person. On the day of discharge, we wait for them to arrive home, and then I just do that first call just to make sure that everything's okay. So we complete the assessment post-discharge, and we're involved for up to 4 weeks. And in that time, we would do the Care Act assessment. It could involve a best interest meeting, a capacity assessment, or housing referrals. We also have a social work team based in the hospital, which manage A&E, front of house, and we have, like in Poole Hospital, we have a rapid assessment ward. So if there's any general inquiries of keeping packages of care, the front of house team would support that. They also deal with sort of any best interests that need to be held on the ward, or if there's any safeguarding concerns. So I just wanted to look at the discharge to assess and kind of look at the benefits and the disadvantages. So there are benefits to the discharge to assess, because that person gets to have their Care Act assessment completed in their own home. Normally, if you've done it, but do it on the hospital, in the ward, it's not the same as them being in their own home environment. Also, once they've gone home, if you need anything like equipment, access to therapy services, you can link in quite quickly and get equipment delivered, such as a commode or perching stool. We have access to community MDTs, so if they're particular person that keeps being readmitted, we can link in with the GPs. They have weekly MDT. So I think we've got a better link with our health colleagues. And also the client has up to 4 weeks free care until long-term needs identified. The disadvantages is no longer able to go up to the ward. So normally you could tell a lot going through the medical notes, get to know the person, and probably the information sometimes isn't relayed to the person about the discharge to assess and how the funding works. So normally when they're discharged home, they don't have a clear understanding of what is to come. There is a huge lack of resource of care. So sometimes they will go out with the rapid response service, and then it's taken quite a while to then source a long-term package of care if they need it. And also one of the other disadvantages is that sometimes the ward can sometimes overprescribe, or we feel that maybe they underprescribe, so we sort of have to increase that care on the day of discharge. So I was going to use a case example of one. So I had a client that was discharged home. It was a gentleman who had had no services before and was discharged home. The ward felt that he would just need a morning visit and a tea time visit. So he went home. I made that first call to the wife. She was in tears. She didn't know how they were going to manage. It turns out that they didn't have any equipment in place. So I was able to go straight out, visit that person, and I was able to sort of link in with what we call the intermediate care team. And from that, they were able to come out, they were able to assess for equipment such as a commode, a hospital bed for this gentleman, and other equipment. I was able to increase the care straight away to 5 times a day, and I also put in a nighttime visit. But prior to the D2A, if we need to increase the care, we'd have to do our assessment, have it agreed by management, and then it would have to go to brokerage. But under the D2A, because it's on the day of discharge, we were able just to instantly increase that care. So it resolved itself. And the outcome from that is that obviously the wife felt reassured. Because I was able to put the equipment in, and she knew that she had me there as a contact. And after 1 week, the wife called to say that she felt that the visits could be reduced, And after 3 weeks, the care was reduced to 1 call a day, which was just a morning call. So I think this was quite a good example of how the D2A can work well when resources are available.
Thank you for that, Shelley, and for sharing that. And I know
Right.
as an apprentice, it's like a huge deal, isn't it, to talk and present like that and to go first. And I think you did a great job there.
Thank you.
As I was listening to you though, Shelley, there were a couple of things that struck me. So I don't know if it's okay for me to share this with you because I wasn't planning to, but just a couple of things that really struck me was I was really interested in thinking about the advantages of discharge to assess. And it really made sense to me when you were talking about actually you're making the assessment of the person at home, aren't you? Because when I first started social work, because I'm a bit of a dinosaur and I've been around for years, hospital social workers would go out from the ward with the person to their home for an afternoon and then bring them back to the hospital again whilst they set things up. I mean, these are the very, very olden days. And that really made sense to me because I then thought when they stopped doing that, I absolutely thought, how can you do an assessment of somebody on a hospital ward? You don't even know what their home environment's like or what they've got in their home environment. So to me, that makes a lot of sense. But then the fact that the initial care plan and things is put in by health, that would really concern me around. So the example that you've given, I think, shows how the social model brings it a lot into thinking about how we do it. But then the other thing that really struck me was how much jargon we use and how much I was thinking, I bet you're going to have to start explaining some of this in the chat, Shelley. People are going to ask, what's an MDT? What's a D2A? What's a literally we get so into using things that we don't see it as jargon, do we? But then somebody else who's never worked in that field before will. So I think you're probably going to have loads of questions about that presentation in the chat. I can imagine. I can't see the chat when I'm screen sharing, but I can see you'll have lots in the chat. So thank you very much for sharing that, Shelley. And I'm sure you've met lots of your apprenticeship standards in doing that, and there's audience will give you loads of feedback, I'm sure, around what you've just shared. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Shelley. And you can breathe now and sit back and enjoy everybody else's presentation, can't you? So thank you for that, Shelley.
Thank you.
So we're going to go now to actually a guest who will be potentially very familiar to you. If you have attended a number of our webinars, then Amanda joined us, I think for the first time Amanda joined us was webinar 10, where Amanda was actually at that point, you were doing a return to social work course, weren't you? And you shared with us, Amanda, a model that you developed for reflection. And then you joined us again with Colin, that you're going to introduce us to now in social work with 42 objects. So Amanda, I'm going to hand straight over to you, but I just thought I'd better tell people that if they recognise you, that they're right to recognise you. You've been with us before. So I'm going to hand straight over to you, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks, Siobhan. And I'm really, really glad to be back and to be adding into this this first concept webinar. I just wanted to talk about the slide that I've chosen there, sort of day in the life of hospital social worker, and it's got the megaphone there because that is the crux of what we do with social work. We are the voice for people, we advocate for people, we make sure their views and their wishes are respected and included in any plans that are made for them. And that we make sure that they are kept central, and so we shout loud, and particularly in hospital social work, I have to do a lot of shouting loud. So just to talk a little bit about me, I've been a qualified social worker for about 15 years. I started out in the mid-2000s as a social worker working in child protection, right at the front door there, and funnily enough it was another fast-paced and high-pressure role, just as this one is in hospital social work. After 5 years of doing child protection, I decided that I would take a bit of a career break to look after my little boy. And we ran away to the countryside and had a rest for a few years. And then I started work in the adult sector, working as a sheltered housing warden, and this led on to me being an independent support worker. And then the pandemic hit, and my work as a support worker wasn't seen as quite as essential as it had been prior to COVID. And so all the work sort of dried up, and I decided to refocus on supporting my local community and running the voluntary group to help those who needed to isolate and stay home. And whilst I was in the midst of setting up Meals on Wheels and a food bank and some runners to get prescriptions and things, an advert popped up from the local government association offering a free return to social work course, and I just jumped straight in. I'd looked previously before, and I hadn't been able to go to any courses where they'd been in universities. Living so rurally, the commute would have been undoable. But with the pandemic, and this course was entirely online, and so it was accessible to me. So I jumped straight in with both feet. And during doing that course, I found Siobhan's webinars, Wednesday webinars, and joined in with a couple. And the placement that I did as part of my return to social work was with a hospital social work team, who at the time was advertising. And so I went for the role, and my course finished in the August, and I started work as hospital social worker in the September. So I've been in post now just over a year. And I'm now promoted to locality lead, covering 2 hospitals on the coast, sunny Minehead and Williton. And as Siobhan mentioned, I've had Colin with me all the way throughout my whole social work career, and I'll leave you to look up the social work objects webinar that he stars in. He's quite a well-known character, and very important to my journey, and also important to a lot of colleagues who have got lots of Colin babies. But you'll find out about that when you have a look at that webinar. So to carry on, to sort of explain where my hospital fits in, I don't work in a acute hospital. I work in a community hospital. So that's where, if they don't go out on the D2A pathway, which Shelley was talking about, so if it's not quite safe for them to go home for whatever reason, it might be that they need a bit of extra rehab, a bit of a slower stream of rehab, and help with getting them independent overnight, and that sort of thing. Or it might be that their health conditions, etc., have progressed to an extent where we might need to be looking at placement, and so they come into the hospital for a few weeks there. And there's a variety of different levels, and this is a bit of a boring looking slide, but I think the slides get sent out, and it might be useful for people that are looking at this area to sort of get an understanding of the different options available. And community hospitals in the middle there. So to talk about the sort of crux of what we do day to day, for those that are interested in actually doing a role, I can't talk for the acutes, but for the community hospitals, the general thing is you will have a ward that is you're the link social worker for. So in Minehead, the ward has got 19 people on it, or beds as the medical team refer to them. It'll be the broken leg in A2, and I'm forever sort of going, oh, do you mean Mr. Jones? You know, and sort of reminding them that they're people. And we have to know those people. We have to have an awareness and an understanding of all the people on that ward and what plans are proposed for them, where they might where the plans might be leading to, when their families visit, because we need to involve them with everything. And we attend regular MDTs, multidisciplinary meetings, which we talk about all of the people on the ward. And even if we're not actively assessing every person on the ward, we will have an input to their plans at those meetings. And even if they're sort of self-funders and where they would actually find their own care home and their own care package, we will offer advice and support to the families and those individuals in order to help find the correct level of care and advise them as to, you know, how much they might need to be looking for. So we really are quite actively involved. So generally I would spend, at the moment we're kind of doing a hybrid model for working. So we're spending sort of 2 to 3 days a week on the ward. And then the other 2 to 3 days we're at home or in the office. And we will, when we're on the ward, we'll go to the multidisciplinary meetings, but we will also do our visits on the ward, going round. And then that usually turns into between 2 and 4 Care Act assessments a week. It depends on who's there and, you know, what type of support they're going to need. And alongside of that, we will do Mental Capacity Act assessments, and we will do best interests decisions for people that have been deemed to lack capacity to understand about their care and accommodation that they need. And also the other part of my role is my role doesn't end when that person leaves hospital. So a little bit like Shelley carries on supporting for those first 4 weeks with the discharge to assess, we will organise the plan, discharge, and then if they've gone home, we will review their care package with phone calls and a visit within that next sort of 2 to 3 weeks if they've got home, to check in, make sure everything's okay, and if there's any amendments needed, we'll do that. But we also go out and review people that have moved into care homes and nursing homes, and we'll go and review those after sort of about 4 weeks when they've had a chance to sort of settle in and see how they're going. So we very much stay involved for much longer, which sometimes our health colleagues don't realise, because once the person's left the ward for them, that's that job done, and that's where it ends. But for us, we may keep hold of them for another 3 months, depending on what's going on when they've got home. They might need that extra support from a social worker for much longer. So that can be quite a challenge, because we still need to be assessing the people that are coming through onto the ward. And it can take some time to manage that rolling caseload. This next slide is just a sort of representation of who might be involved with a person on the ward. And generally all these people, apart from maybe the IMCAs, would be in attendance at multidisciplinary meetings. And certainly if we also, sometimes we also have family meetings. So if the case is quite complex, we'll invite the families in and we'll all talk together around a table about what's going on for their relative. And if the relative's able to be part of that, then obviously they come along too. And so all these different people, occupational therapists, nurses, doctors, physios, you know, all those health people. We also have a really good integrated care system with the voluntary sector and village agents in our area. And so they come along to all our multidisciplinary meetings, and they work very closely with us social workers in order to support with finding help and support in the community to bolster up on the care packages and the support for people. And then I think my last slide, I'm sort of touching on the lovely pandemic, and what we're still very much in the throes of, really. I'm not going to talk too much about it because Jen's going to come on and talk a little bit more about how things have affected people working in the acute hospitals. But it's been very strange sort of working from home a lot of the time. You can't always sort of separate work from home, and certainly my cat has decided she's going to be moving around all in the background whilst I'm trying to talk to you guys at the moment, so that can be difficult. Also needing to do virtual assessments. When there's an outbreak on the ward, we can't go on the ward, but we still need to assist with Mental Capacity Act assessments. We still need to be able to talk to the patient. So our health colleagues are very good at setting up video calls, etc. But it just really is not the same as being there in person. You haven't got that the same connection there. You're just a little box on a screen, and it's like watching telly for them, and it feels very surreal. I think it's particularly for the people that are stuck in hospital, and also wearing full PPE and trying to communicate with somebody that's perhaps quite hard of hearing. They often say, "I can't hear you with that mask on," because they don't realise how much they rely on lip reading. We have got masks that are see-through, but then they actually steam up when you're talking, so then they can't see anyway. And also, I mean, how the nurses do it for their great big long shifts, I don't know, because it's so hot. It's so, and I'm a very hot person, and I'm of a certain age where I get even hotter on odd occasions, and being in that PPE is quite hard at times. And the other thing that is quite upsetting for people that have to move into placement, or even if they're only moving into placement temporarily, because there's such a premium on where there are rooms available in the nursing homes, and if there are nursing or care homes that have got outbreaks and they're close to admissions in the local areas, we've been having to place people 2-3 hours away from their home and their families. And then what we have been doing is, when there has been a place open up near their home, we've been bringing them back in. But then it's quite traumatic for people to move from hospital to care home to another care home, and back again. And we're heading into a situation again with this winter where we're going to be doing an awful lot of that again. And also we've got people that need care packages that are just simple care packages that we would source no problem previously. They might only need care a couple of times a day or 3 times a day, and we can't source that care, but they're medically optimized for discharge, so they can't stay in the hospital. And so we're having to say to them, we really do need to try and move you on into a care home just temporarily while we source the care, but we can't promise any timescales on that because we don't know how long it's going to take to source. And by the time they're with us in the community hospital, they've already had their traumatic experience in the acute, and then they've come and they've progressed with their rehab, and they've been told they're doing really, really well, and that we're going to source a care package and we're going to get them back home, and they're all geared up for that. And then they're being told, actually, do you know what? You're not going home just yet. And that, that's a difficult conversation to have. I've had quite a few of those this week because our local acute hospitals just declared a critical incident. So there's a real big push to get movement out of the community hospitals so that we can get a little bit of flow there. So that's a real difficult part of our job. But
Yeah.
that said, I love my job, and I wouldn't do any other role really. I'm really happy in my work as a hospital social worker, and I do like the turnover of people that I see, and the different complexities that there are. You really do see everything coming through the door, and it's really interesting, challenging, but very interesting at the same time. And it's a fantastic placement for a student to do. So if there's any students that are offered hospital social workers, go for it, because it ticks all those boxes that you need for your placements.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for sharing that. And I think what you were starting to touch on at the end there really shows what we've talked about in previous webinars of moral injury. There are lots of examples, I think, at the moment, because of the care crisis, of experiencing that sense of not being able to do what you want to do or the way in which you want to do it, and that leading to a moral injury. So thank you for sharing that, Amanda. That was fabulous. And as you said, we're going to go on to explore a bit more around that impact of COVID-19 with some fabulous photographic slides from our next guest, if I can get my slides to move, Jen. So Jen, if you want to put your mic on and step in at this point, thank you.
Perfect. So, hi everyone, my name's Jen. I'm a hospital social worker and I work in an acute hospital at Royal Bolton Hospital. So just a little bit about me. Please forgive that I'm wearing the same dress. So we only realised today that the same in the picture is what I'm wearing now. So I qualified as a social worker from Lancaster University in 2014. And that was where I first found my passion for hospital social work. I did my final placement at Blackpool. After I finished my degree, I was only 21, so I took a break from statutory social work. I didn't feel I had enough life experience at the time, or I didn't feel confident enough. So I moved into third sector social work in the local community and worked my way into management. And then in 2017, I returned back into statutory social work and obtained a post at Royal Bolton Hospital in the integrated discharge team. And I've been there ever since. I completed my ASYE there. I've gained so much experience. I've recently become a practice educator, and it was the place where I've really gained a lot of experience and a passionate and keen interest in safeguarding adults because of the vast amount of different people and from different walks of life and different challenging situations that come into a hospital. You know, we often think about hospital social work as being lots of people over the age of 70 that have had a fall, when the reality is that we're coming into hospital for lots of different reasons, you know, substance misuse, domestic violence, homeless people, learning disabilities, mental health problems. And so I would say for anybody who wants a wide range of social work experience, hospital social work is absolutely the place to gain lots of vital and key skills. So next slide. So working in an acute hospital setting, we actually didn't focus on a discharge to assess model, and we worked a lot differently than most of the teams in the Northwest area. So we remained on hospital wards right from the beginning in the first wave of the pandemic, and to current day we've never worked from home. We've always remained on hospital wards, visiting patients, attending multidisciplinary team meetings. It's been a real eye-opener, but also I wouldn't have had it any other way. It's been brilliant. So we've adapted daily to changes in legislation, policies, procedures. We've really had to bend backwards and be flexible in how we work, and often not really knowing what we're doing because it changes from hour sometimes. We made a lot of changes to how we work as a team. So we introduced therapy-led discharges for patients with mental capacity and with no previous services in place. We actually didn't get involved with that. We let the physiotherapists and the occupational therapists manage that and set up new packages of care with our home support reablement team. What we also did is we did introduce discharge to assess placements, and we used them in two different places. We used them in our intermediate care units, which Janine will go on to talk to later. And we also purchased some discharge to assess placements in the local residential and nursing homes. So we blocked them out, and they were specifically for people coming out of hospital, and they stayed there for 6 weeks while they had a longer period of assessment. So that could have been for maybe they had a broken bone that needed to heal before they could go home. Maybe they were experiencing a period of delirium that made them more confused than normal, and we're waiting for that to resolve. So that's how we mainly use the discharge to assess models. We obtained responsibility for discharge planning for out of area patients. So as I mentioned before, in the Northwest, Bolton was the only hospital social workers to attend the wards on a day-to-day basis. And so we took responsibility for all the out of area patients. And as a Greater Manchester wide system, we made like a universal referral and trusted assessment system. So the main thing I'm going to talk to you today about is about mental capacity assessments on COVID wards, and that is something that day to day, still now, and what we've always done is completed throughout my time as a hospital social worker. So what I want to talk about first is the challenges that we had in completing the mental capacity assessments. So when we first started in the first wave, I think the first challenge that we had was complete fear. And it's okay to be completely open and honest to say that there were hundreds and sometimes thousands of people, you know, dying every day of COVID. And so as a social worker, being asked to walk into a room full of people with that infection, not knowing, you know, whether it was going to get me, was it going to get the nurses on the ward, you just don't know. And so it is frightening, it's scary, and to this day it's still a frightening and scary experience to be asked to go on them wards. So mental capacity assessments are all about active listening. They're about listening to the individual, taking on board what they're saying, weighing it up with the information you already have with that person. So what do I already know? Is that matching up to what they're saying? Are they showing me that they have insight into risk? Are they accurately recalling information back to me? And so trying to really accurately listen to what the person is saying to you, but at the same time, be scared to your core about what's going on around you is really, really difficult. It's really hard to concentrate. Linking into that is the distractions also that you have around you. So it's a medical ward. They have, you know, oxygen machines, ventilators, poorly people coughing. And so really, when you're trying to concentrate really heavily on what the person's saying to you, it can be really difficult with that going on in the background. I'd say, like the previous speaker talked about with communication, and as you saw from the picture, the mask is metal clamped to your face here, and so that is really, really stuck there, and so that can muffle your speech. It can really, you know, find it difficult for you to, and it's frustrating to get across what you're trying to say to the person. A lot of the time the people on the ward are hard of hearing, they can't hear you well in the first place, let alone with a mask over your face. And so because of that, it's really hard for them to understand. And with them, your mouth covered, obviously they can't lip read, and a lot of older adults do rely on that to be able to communicate. And so that was really a big challenge in completing mental capacity assessments. I would say one of the big parts of completing a capacity assessment is relationship-based practice. It's about getting to know your service user. It's about drawing out the best in them and being able to draw on their strengths. It's about assuming they have capacity also. And so every day, patients on a ward must see hundreds of people, all pretty much, they probably look the same, and they probably can't recognise one from another. How would you tell a doctor from a nurse, from a physio, from a social worker when everybody's got goggles, a mask on, a pinny on, and gloves on? You absolutely wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And so they can't see your facial expressions, they can't see your smile. And so that's really hard when you're completing a capacity assessment, to build that relationship up with them. Because more often than not, a capacity assessment needs to be done over 2, 3, 4 visits. And so if they can't remember you each time, it's really hard to pick up where you left off. and to be able to, you know, draw the best out of them and be able to have them critical discussions if every time you're trying to regurgitate the same information. I would say the final challenge that I'm going to touch on is time. So with the easements of the Care Act during coronavirus, this allowed local authorities to not carry out detailed assessments on patients when leaving hospital. It meant that we could just get a snapshot image of a patient and commission the services without going into great detail. However, from our team's point of view and our understanding of the Mental Capacity Act, that remained in place, and we were told to still do detailed Mental Capacity Act and best interest decisions. So when trying to, you know, move patients on from hospital, we have a real clash of the two legislations. They weren't married up together. You had one telling us to move dead quickly and one telling us to keep completing a very thorough assessment. So the hospital that I worked in gave us a really quick target of discharging patients. They wanted us to get, from the assessment notification we received, we got told that we need to have them at least out of hospital within 3 hours. So within the reality of completing a mental capacity assessment, a best interest document, liaising with the family, doing a needs assessment, finding a discharge to assess a residential home, and getting the patient out in 3 hours, not always realistic. We tried our best, and the intermediate care units that Janine will go to talk about were amazing and helped us move patients really quickly over. But it is a real clash between a medical model and a social model in terms of what the NHS's expectations are, but our social work values and our morals clash in there, because you also want to do your patient justice, and you also want to give them a comprehensive assessment that you feel is a good standard for you as a social worker. You never want to give, you know, a substandard assessment. So that was really hard. Chris Whitty, next slide. So how can we overcome some of these challenges? So this is not how to do a capacity assessment on a ward with COVID. This is just the kind of things that I did when I was working on the COVID wards to try and get the best out of my service users and sort of help them through the mental capacity process. So I used communication aids. I used picture cards. Our speech and language therapists had iPads. We had whiteboards and pens as alternatives to help the service users communicate back with us. You know, a lot of them would have like tracheostomies in, which meant they couldn't speak. They could have nasal cannulas in, NIV masks on, and often even just being breathlessness and the absolute not being able to get your breath is really hard for patients to communicate. And so having these alternative communication methods are really good, because just because somebody can't verbally communicate doesn't mean that they cannot communicate a decision back to us. I tried to, when we're talking about relationship-based practice, I showed patients pictures of myself on my phone to try and help them recognise a face to a name. And we've seen that, you know, in the first wave with ICU nurses printing pictures off and putting it on the pinnies. And I thought that was a really good way to try and incorporate into my practice as well. Another way of doing it as well is just disclosing a small piece of information, a little bit insignificant, but something that might trigger a patient to remember something about me that might trigger the conversation back to help them retain some of the things we talked about earlier. So for example, I play football and I coach a girls' football team. So I would often just give a bit of a nugget of information like that. And then I could say, I came to talk to you earlier, we talked about this. Do you remember any other parts of the, you know, the assessment? And so that was really good for the service user. When we was going through the first wave, we actually did the moral injury training with Siobhan. And after completing the assessments, we were really, really tired, and it can take a lot of you being on the ward for an hour. And so something I really took away from that was learning to look after your own physical health and well-being and not running yourself into the ground. So, for example, I'd come off the COVID ward and quickly started bombing through my assessment, and I wouldn't even give myself time to think about what had just happened. So things like taking a lunch break, confiding in my colleagues, going for a short walk, going to the gift shop and getting a chocolate biscuit or a twirl bar. Then were just small things I could just sit for 20 minutes and just really think about my assessment before bombing through everything. And I think the last thing to overcome some of these challenges is using your professional integrity and judgment when you're completing these assessments. So sometimes within my role, 3 hours is not realistic, and it's not a bad thing to turn to your manager or turn to the person that you're working with and saying, I'm sorry, but that's not appropriate, and I cannot, for the patient's safety and for my own social work practice, put my name to that discharge. This person needs longer in hospital, or this person is not safe to leave hospital, or actually this person doesn't want to go to a discharge to assess placement, and so it may take a little bit longer to put a care package in, but that's the way I feel. And if they've already got COVID, and I appreciate the pressures, but we have to balance the hospital pressures with their rights and responsibilities and their values, and keeping the person at the heart of the assessment. And so I think it's really important sometimes to use your professional integrity to stand up for what you believe in within hospital social work. And actually, a lot of medical professionals will respect you for that, and then trust you when you say you cannot do something compared to when you can. They will know your boundaries and learn to, respect your opinion for it. Next slide.
Cool.
So thank you for listening. It's a really incredible and rewarding role that I have within my social work team, and I've been really grateful to the hospital and to my social work colleagues for all the support throughout COVID. For anybody who's working at home and potentially going on the wards for the first time, I hope that's been a good insight, or for students who potentially want to work as hospital social workers. I hope that's been a bit of a realistic idea of what it's like to be a hospital social worker. And if you have any questions, I'll be in the chat, or I can answer anything that you might want to ask.
Thanks, Jen. I think that was great. And you know what really came through there was how much hospital social workers have been really fighting for the rights of people all the way through the pandemic, and what a brilliant job you've been doing of that. So thank you very much for what you've shared there, Jen. And as you said, what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to Janine, who is going to tell us a bit about, it's kind of smoothly going to move through, isn't it? Because we're going to move on to Janine, who's going to put a mic on now and tell us about integrated care and multi-agency working. So it's over to you, Janine.
Hello, everyone. My name is Janine McLaughlin, and I'm currently employed as a deputy manager. So I manage the intermediate tier team over at Bolton. I've been a social worker for 17 years. My area of practice has always been adults, so I did actually qualify as a learning disability nurse and social worker, but I did end up going into the route of social work. So I've done physical disabilities and learning disabilities, and then ever since I've always done hospital work and intermediate care. So over the last sort of 12 years or so, my service has sort of been in the hospital and been part of one team. Then we've been split when we've had a restructure, we've gone back, we've gone, vice versa. But at the moment, we are two separate sort of identities, but I call ourselves sister services because we're very closely interlinked, and it's really important that we work together. I'm also an advanced practitioner and advanced practice educator, and I currently still practice as a social work mentor for our social work apprentices. And at the moment, I am a project manager for the Greater Manchester Social Work Academy. So what I wanted to focus on for this session is just to understand a little bit about multi-agency working or multidisciplinary teams. So there will be bits of jargon, but where I can, I will try and use the actual words because I'm not a lover of jargon, but you do find that very heavily in hospital and medical type social work. From the chat, there was lots of questions about sort of D2A and funding. So I've just made some notes while I've been listening because it does kind of interlink on this slide. So what I wanted to kind of have a look at the moment is actually what drives us to work together. What is it in sort of legislation, in policy, in guidance that tells us as practitioners we need to work together. So integrated care has been around for some time. It's not a new concept. So those people that might have been around in health and social care for some time will already know this. But in 1990, when we had the NHS Community Care Act, that was kind of sort of the first pieces of legislation that kind of were telling us we needed to join up and we needed to work together. More recently, there's the Health and Social Care Act in 2012, and that act was again based on previous legislation, was placing duties on local authorities via their joint and health and wellbeing boards to encourage us to work in an integrated way. So we needed to kind of bring that relationship of health and social care together, because actually we're an interdependency. If the person isn't living healthy or they have a healthcare need, the chances are then they're going to end up with a social care need and vice versa. So then there was a paper in 2013, and that paper was about integrated care and looking at our own commitment as a nation, about working collaboratively. And basically the government was setting out a framework for integrated services, and that led to then some pioneers throughout the country doing some projects to test these approaches. Then we had the Care Act in 2014, which again places the duties on local authorities to promote integration, but it also highlights the importance of us being co-productive with service users, so working in co-production. So just to touch a little bit on some of the D2A questions that were mentioned. So traditionally, reablement services would come from something called NICE guidelines, and that was quite a few years ago, and that was the NICE guidelines for older people, and that was an initiative that said, we have an aging population. We need to support older people to live healthier and to live longer. So the initiatives behind that was about how do we promote independence and how do we avoid people going into residential care. And the aim was to get people home and living longer and healthier. So from that was the development sort of intermediate care facilities and reablement, and that's where you'll hear probably the 6 weeks rule. So there's kind of a 6-week timeline, not necessarily set in stone, but that's where that 6 weeks is from, to give you a guideline of where the timescales that we're working under. Now, in D2A, the NHS was funded by the National Discharge Fund, and they set their parameters at 4 weeks. And from that, so if you like, the NHS are funding the discharge to assessments for 4 weeks, with the aim of that after that 4-week period, we should have an idea, or an assessment should be done, whether it's continuing healthcare assessments, so their care or support would then be continued to be funded by health, or actually if their needs then fall with the local authority, then the local authority then would pick up funding. So I just thought I'd answer that while we were talking about the drivers. So why do we need to work in an integrated way? It promotes person-centred care. What you find is that all the professionals you work with in an MDT setting, you've all got the same goal. We all want somebody to go home. We want them to go home well. Nobody wants a failed discharge. But what we all do is we all speak to the person. So the person is central to all of our working. Integrated care reduces barriers and access to services. So traditionally, you might struggled to get access, say, to housing, or you might struggle to get access to a third party provider or a service, or to therapy. There might be several forms you've got to fill in. There might be several kind of hoops you've got to jump through just to kind of get an assessment. The beauty of working together is that actually you're sharing information constantly. So it leads on to the next one. It avoids us duplicating a lot of our work, because what we find is we're writing the same things. So I know T may be writing something, I might be writing my assessment, but actually a lot of the bulk of what we're recording is actually the same. So working together allows us to sort of pick up work from each other to kind of streamline that process. Working together means that we're working collaboratively, and it means then we can take a more holistic view of that individual's needs. So if we have a doctor or a medic there, they can come at it from a medical point of view. We have our therapy leads, our therapy teams, who will come at it from a therapeutic rehabilitation point of view. And our role as social worker is to look at it from an holistic point of view, looking at how all these interdependencies impact then on people, and actually to understand the person's needs and how we're then going to support them. It avoids repetition and the promotion of only telling my story once. And this is something that's really close to my heart. And we've really tried to do a lot of work in Bolton, trying to look at how we integrate our systems. Because what you find is when people move through these services, so they go into hospital, they might see a social worker there. They come into my service, they might see a different social worker here. They then get discharged to the community. They then see another social worker or another professional, another team of people. And each time what they shouldn't be doing is keep repeating and telling the story. So we're trying to integrate our systems where the story is told once and that is picked up, and it then is weaved like a golden thread throughout all in the systems. We are aiming to pool resources and pool budgets, so then we're not having to jump through the hoops to get access to funding or access to resources. It promotes effective communication. If we're working together and you're actually sat together, you're sometimes just having conversations a lot of the time, which promotes us to ensure that we're getting the information shared. And it also encourages us to be quite creative with our approaches. I've had many creative visits with an OT on home visits, so it helps you to think outside of the box and bounce ideas off. I might have an idea, but then if you're bouncing it off a colleague, you think, oh, I've never thought of that before. Let's look at how we can support that. And often what you find in services is that they can be fragmented. So working together kind of helps us to prevent that. Next slide, please. So some of the barriers, so some of the kind of difficulties and challenges, I've split it into 3 different things. And one of them is, from my perspective and my experience, is organisational issues. So what we get is, from an organisation, when we're trying to work together, is understanding management structures. So there's been lots of different models tried and tested throughout the country, which might mean you may be a social worker in a multidisciplinary team, but you may be managed by a nurse, or you may be managed by a different professional, which sometimes can feel a bit uncomfortable, or you're uncertain about it. And then because you then sometimes have, I think Jen touched on it, about the clashes between health and social care, is that sometimes if you get those clashes, it means that you've not got a joint vision. And if you've not got a joint vision of working together, that can be challenging, and it can create a culture. So sometimes you might be working in services where you're trying to change your way of working or being creative. And I've just put some narratives in of what I've heard over the years where, well, we've always done it this way, so why change it? Or we've tried that before and it didn't work. And sometimes you've got to be kind of really creative in how you kind of engage people and work with each other. Sometimes we've got challenges, as I've mentioned before, about accessibility to services and having a unified budget. It's written in every single policy that you've read over the years about pooling resources and pooling budgets. We're not quite there yet, and I do think it's going to be a while before we are. There's other organisational issues, because what sometimes happens is that people co-locate, which is great. So we sit together or we sit on the floor in a room, but co-location doesn't necessarily mean that we work together. You can still have silos or work in silos if the vision isn't shared between all professionals. There is some professional issues, so they might have role blurring where one partner might think is dominating over another. So if you're in a team that's predominantly health, you might feel like the lone voice. You might feel a bit isolated. If you've got lack of clarity in responsibility about who's responsible for what task, that can sometimes lead to misinterpretation, leads to miscommunication. And that affects how we then work effectively, and more importantly, it affects how you form your relationships. And then lastly, having frequent changes to policy and then guidance. It can often feel like the goalpost is constantly moving. So particularly during COVID, I can't tell you how many times, just when I thought I got it right with a policy or a process, it then kept moving on and we kept having to go back and change it. So looking at MDT in practice, this was just kind of a model just to kind of show you how that might work. So it normally, an MDT or a multidisciplinary team would consist of several different health and social care or sometimes third partner agencies. So the person's always at the middle. We would normally have a doctor or a medic, a pharmacy, social worker, occupational therapist, physio, nurse, and then occasionally we might have representation from our voluntary sector, which might be mental health, or recently we've had Age UK. MDTs look different throughout in the country depending on the demographic and the resources available. The model I've shown was just trying to give sort of an idea of how that might look in practice. We've had great engagement from mental health practitioners. They've been instrumental in supporting us with some very difficult admissions to our intermediate care units, and their insight and knowledge and support it's just been amazing. And we're trying to push for that to continue. We've also had housing support that have been working with us, and they've been an integral part and also supportive in the hospital. So when we're thinking about the purpose is to have an integrated approach to care and needs, and most importantly, ensuring that the goals of the person are included. That often can be forgotten when we're in crisis or we're at a busy period or we're rushing to get a discharge, is actually what does the person want? And that's often what I find we bring as social work to these MDT settings. What we want to be doing, want to be supportive to our colleagues. We do have to adhere to discharge arrangements and timescales, because we need to make sure that we've got a flow and capacity throughout all of the services. Hence why hospitals then go on alert, like Amanda mentioned earlier, and that means then we're in crisis mode. So we do need to keep the flow going. However, we also need to make sure that we're not rushing people out too soon, because then they only end up back into hospital, and that's not good for anybody. So it's about trying to get the balance right. And another important part of MDT working is forming effective relationships. That is the key for me, is having an effective relationship with your MDT, to making sure that you've got a good partnership and that you're well respected. So some examples that I have at the moment of MDT working, we have what we call a red to green meeting. I'm not a lover of the notion of red to green, but we partake in it and it is helpful. But they happen daily with our multidisciplinary colleagues. And that basically is then to say, if someone's green, then they're ready to go home. What are we doing about it? What's the plan? If somebody then has a red tick, there's a reason why that person isn't ready. There's an assessment that needs to take place, so that person remains unwell and is having treatment. So that helps us to forecast what our discharge is going to be for the week, which means then we can tell the hospital the expected discharges we have, so they can monitor their list for discharge. We have a weekly MDT that's more in depth, where patients and service users are and discuss more in depth about what their plans are and we need to do to support them home. Twice weekly as managers, we have what we call a Get Me Home meeting, and that's where we look at people, are they on the track for the timescale for discharge? Is that person going to need a bit longer? Is that person ready to go home but they're not home, so why? How can we support that? So we use those meetings as our escalation route if we're finding that we've got a particular issue, or there's a housing issue, for example, about how then do we support the discharge. So I've been involved in joint assessments and been involved in joint visits. I've also done work with our colleagues to do. We created the therapy-led discharge back in 2017, I think, and that's where we were focusing on therapists referring directly into reablement services, which supported us as social workers. And then we did a process about doing joint mental capacity assessment, again, with our colleagues, because mental capacity is everybody's business. And then lastly, I thought I'd just do some top tips from what I have found over my years in hospital and intermediate care social work. So it's really important that you speak up if you're unsure or you're unclear about the plans. I've often found in these meetings, as the social worker, you are the voice of the person. So you do need to speak up if you're unsure or if something doesn't sound right. You do also need to, try and adhere to those timescales, because they are a very important cog in the wheel, if you like, of hospital work. But we also need to make sure that they're realistic, and Jen focused on that through her presentation. The amount of times we've been sat there and they'll be pushing for a discharge, and you just know it's not going to work, because actually if they had a bit longer practicing stairs or a little bit longer, managing the nighttime needs, and actually let's get that person home when they're ready, because they're more likely then to have a successful discharge. Another good tip is form a relationship with your MDT colleagues. Try having lunch together, share some interests. Some of my best friends have been OTs because I've found that our roles, they overlap. So I found that, I kind of actually building relationships with them. I often didn't feel alone in the MDT, because I always felt my colleagues, they had me back, particularly our occupational therapists. So aim to do joint assessments where possible. And I've actually put, there's no greater power than showing your worth and helping a colleague when they're in a difficult situation. I've done that many a times when people just don't know what to do. They often come to the social worker and say, what do we do with this? And that's where our strengths lie. Our strengths lie in being creative and actually just getting stuck in and trying to help out. And we just do what we can. Remembering the MDT, no decision is solely yours to make. You are a team and we work together, so it's a shared responsibility, and sometimes they need reminding of that. And do not be afraid to speak out and explain what your role is. I've come across many assumptions of what people think we do as them social workers, so do not be afraid to put the record straight. To be clear is to be kind. And then there was just a couple really just to add about, it is helpful to learn some of the medical lingo and some of the jargon. If you're ever on a ward or reading doctors' medical notes, it is a good tip. It really does help. So that would be some good advice. And then the last one, I think Jen touched upon this as well, is be mindful that the people that you're seeing in a hospital setting or in an intermediate care setting, be mindful of how that might feel for them. So they're likely to feel scared, they're likely to feel frightened. It's very, very a strange feeling being in hospital. And I know that from personal experience. You feel exposed and very vulnerable, and just always be mindful of that when you're meeting with somebody. Always be patient, always be attentive, and always be kind. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Janine. I love that message of always be kind, and to be clear is to be kind. I really like that message. So thank you very much for that. And I think what you showed was how much there is involved in intermediate care work and in working in hospitals. And so we have our final speaker, who is going to share different elements with us tonight, actually. So John, if you're there, if you can put your mic on. I met John a few years ago in his work in Focus, and I'm fascinated by the structures that sit around your work, John. So if I can hand over to you as our final guest speaker tonight. Thank you, John.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. Good evening, everyone. It feels a little bit strange talking to my laptop, but I know you're all there. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk about this evening, and I won't go too long, but any questions do please ask. First part is around the legal framework. Now, I don't want this to sound really dry. It's just gone I know this is quite a dry subject, but I thought it'd be really important to give some context to how hospital social work has changed so much in the last 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic, and why. And then also the second part I'd like to talk to you about is around how different structures look. As Siobhan alluded to, the system that I work as part of in North East Lincolnshire as quite a unique structure, and I think it will tap into some of those bits around sharing of budgets and how those different ideas come together and how different systems can look. So pre-March last year, the hospital discharges from a social work perspective, and for anyone requiring support from the local authority, were governed by the Care Act. Now, there was a whole set of expectations and rules, if you like, around how a discharge should be done and the timescales it should be done within, and they were all set in the context of the Care Act. Now, the reason that this part is important, because obviously the Care Act is more than just about hospital discharges. It encompasses a whole raft of other duties of the local authority and powers and responsibility, but also underlying principles around things like person first, the wellbeing principle, the duty, as Janine was talking about earlier, the duty to work collaboratively, work together, and the duty or the power to be able to pull budgets and draw monies together. And this was very much the kind of background to how hospital discharge systems were often established. So across health and social care, health and different elements of the social care picture had duties under the Care Act. Now, when we got to around March of 2019, the picture changed. So as March of 2020, the picture changed, and the Coronavirus Act, which someone's just mentioned in the chat, was the replacement, if you like, for the Care Act. So what that effectively did was suspend that element of the Care Act and the duties the local authority had under it, the powers they had to provide finance and services around it as well, the element of charging for services on discharge from hospital for service users, and was replaced with the hospital discharge guidance as a kind of subset of the Coronavirus Act. What this did in its first incarnation, we're now into our fifth incarnation of this guidance, and as others have alluded to earlier, the pace of change, I can't quite articulate how fast it was to be able to do that in the real world and to redesign whole systems literally overnight. At the beginning of the pandemic, I remember working some very, very late hours trying to work with our colleagues across health and social care to redesign a service and a system that had been so well established. Was a huge, huge challenge. And in the first incarnation, there was a line within that guidance that said that all discharges should be health-led. Now, that's the language it used. The interpretation of that across systems varied wildly. We've heard from some people tonight who've said that their system kept their social workers in hospital, and that was their choice to be able to do that. It was, for other systems such as ours, it meant that the discharges then became led by the secondary health trust. So they were led by nurses predominantly, and health staff on the ward, sometimes OTs. It was a bit of a godsend when it was OTs, because the working relationships that we had before that was very, very close, and there was a lot of sharing of knowledge and understanding before the social workers moved out of the hospital. Obviously, I'm not in any way saying negatively about our health colleagues. The challenges that they faced were incredible, and the way that they've managed those has been inspiring, really. But it's also fair to say that knowledge around people's social care issues and local authority function in terms of arrangements of care packages and providers and the market was really not their strong suit. So as other people have alluded to this evening, we often saw underprescription or overprescription of care, people not being involved in their care planning. The first incarnation of the guidance said that people only had to be informed of the plans around their care. It did not say that they had to be involved in central. Now, as the different iterations of the guidance have come along, more and more value base has been included, because it was a criticism, I think, across the whole system, that there was not enough inclusion of carers, of individuals, consideration of people's kind of wider situations, and also just talking to people. It was incredibly evident that that was missing when people were coming out of hospital into the community. The unfortunate part about that is some of that has stuck, and some of that initial learning in different pockets of our local system certainly is stuck, and the people's engagement and being kind of central to those decision making elements and packages of support have certainly not been there, which does cause a huge point of frustration, as our first speaker said this evening about the pros and cons around the discharge to assess model. Now, what the Coronavirus Act and the subsequent hospital discharge guidance did also do, which we've kind of touched on, was provide a 4-week funding window where people could have services provided to them without charge, so without financial assessment. And this is different to the non-chargeable services from intermediate tier that we've talked about as well this evening. So they're kind of two separate funding streams, and might be delivering services in different ways. So the services that were provided free of charge under the COVID-19 funding were for people who needed longer term packages of care at home. Now, also, as we've talked about this evening, what was not suspended as part of any kind of changes through the Coronavirus Act was the Mental Capacity Act. So there was still full requirement for people to have mental capacity assessments and best interest assessments, which I've answered some questions on in the Q&A throughout. So where there was still concerns or risks about people's cognitive function and understanding, the Mental Capacity Act still had to be upheld. However, as we've talked about as well this evening, there was other pressure in the system to discharge people faster, with, as we were saying, those initial 2 and 3 hour discharge timescales were unrealistic for people where there was more complexity around the situation. There was critique, and still continues to be critique, about the hospital discharge guidance in terms of inclusion of the Human Rights Act principles, which obviously the Care Act really heavily underpins. But there was certainly critique in its early versions that people's human rights weren't considered. Now, it is a really complex mesh of legislation and how these things all fit together. So happy to take some more questions on if you would like, but otherwise I'm going to move on to the next part of my talk. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about integration, and Janine was talking about integration and budgets, and how, although the Care Act talks and other pieces of legislation talk about working together and the ability to pool budgets, doesn't always happen. Now, I wanted to just use my authority as a bit of a case study example to show how different areas approach this very differently. So the area that I work in provides all of their community and primary health and social care services through a sorry, excuse me. So they're all provided in the community, not directly by either the NHS or by the local authority. So just to explain a little bit about how that works, budgets effectively monies from the local authority, public health and the NHS for primary and community care functions are pooled with the clinical commissioning group. So the clinical commissioning group then looks to commission providers to deliver services across the county. So for adult social care, for primary care, for mental health, for end-of-life care, GP services, carers services, and some of the logos and organisations that I've put there are just to give examples of organisations that include social workers and social work functions. Now, all of these organisations are set up as community interest companies in one way, shape or form. The organisation that I work for is Focus, and we provide all of the statutory adult social care assessment and micro-commissioning brokerage functions that you would typically see being provided by the local authority, provided by us as an independent community interest company, with funding that comes from the clinical commissioning group, and the local authority has devolved their responsibility to the clinical commissioning group to arrange someone else, if you like, to provide the statutory adult social care function. Across the patch, we've then got half a dozen other community interest companies who, I say, provide mental health services, primary care, intermediate tier services, podiatry, OT and physio, therapies, and are all devolved through these different organisations. So in terms of integration and working together, it does feel very different in this system because these are separate organisations coming together that are neither local authority nor are they NHS. They're kind of their own entities. There's also 3 GP federations, so none of the GPs or community nurses in our area are employed directly by the NHS. They're all employed by the federations with devolved NHS monies. So it does bring its own challenges. As we've talked about, integrated working is never always a smooth journey, but one that is absolutely vital for us providing services to our service users and people who use services to ensure we've got something seamless, really, from an end user perspective. In terms of hospital discharges, this was it was very different in terms of how we then brought these services together to form a community hub. So while the secondary trust did the primary element of discharging the person from hospital and making that initial plan for them, elements of all of these services then work together in the community to provide MDT assessment, support and input for people following discharge from hospital. So it was about bringing everyone together around a table to say, we still need to provide these functions. We're no longer reaching into the hospital to provide them. And how are we going to gear that up? So as we were speaking about earlier, we have MDT meetings every day where there's representation from all of those organisations. And we're really putting the person at the centre of that to look at how we can all bring our respective specialities to that individual to make sure that their journey out of hospital to home in the community is the right one. So I hope that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of something different and how things can look differently. Again, happy to take questions either now or later, but thank you very much.
Thanks, John. I think that's really helpful because I think people need to see actually that there are a whole range of different systems in place about how we manage the sort of interface between health and social care and different organisations. And, you know, I've always found Focus a really interesting organisation and because it's kind of social work service led by social workers. I find it just quite fascinating. So thank you very much for sharing that there, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you in the chat. What I'd say about tonight, our very first context webinar, huge amounts of material that's been shared with you tonight, and we'll reflect on that and we'll use your feedback about what we do in our future context webinars. But what I think it's shown for me is the value of attending our webinars live, because people who've been here live have been able to get answers to questions and engage in chat with 5 experts in the field. And I can see that I just popped into the chat. I don't normally go in there when I'm screen sharing because it scares me that I might lose something, but I had a quick look just as you were talking there, John, about what's been going on in the chat and in the Q&A, and I think it's been really helpful for people that you've been here and able to share things. So really it just remains for me to say thank you ever so much to all of our guests tonight. I think what you've done is given us a huge flavour of the massive variety of hospital social work, really, and different types of hospital, different types of work, and even just the way in which it's delivered differently in different areas of the country. So thank you ever so much to all of our guests. It's been a really, really useful session, and I've learned a lot from tonight. So thank you for joining us for our first context webinar, and I'm really glad we chose to do that about hospital social work. I know that people like to know at the end what we've got coming up over the next few weeks, and I know that Dave is always busy in the chat putting in the links so that you can register for next week. We're looking at anti-racist practice. We're actually looking at widening the debate around anti-racism. We try and have something about anti-racist practice in every season. So we've got some different aspects of anti-racist practice next week. Then we'll be looking at ethics in social work, and then we've got a back to basics looking at building your confidence in reflective practice before looking at social work, which actually we wrote the title of this right at the start of planning, like in the summer. We wrote social work post-COVID, and now I'm thinking, are we going to be post-COVID by the 1st of December? I'm really not sure. That might be a little bit of a hopeful title we've got there. We might need to change the title. I put it in inverted commas because I thought that when I was putting it on the slide. Maybe not. Maybe we're a bit premature with that, but we'll be looking at social work post-COVID with the 2 heads of the Principal Social Worker Network for Children and Families. So we've got a range of different topics coming up. Thank you very much to our guests for joining us and leading tonight, and thank you to everybody for coming, and good night. See you next week. Bye.